Hey everybody, Pastor Stephen Anderson here from Faithful Word Baptist Church in Phoenix, Arizona. This is part 2 of my life story, and in this video, I'm going to focus on a very magical place that we would visit growing up, and that place was Grandmother and Dick's house. Now, Grandmother and Dick, that might sound a little strange, like why did we call him Dick? Because it almost sounds like a step-parent or something. But no, this was my biological grandfather. His name is Richard Tackerberry, and he just insisted on being called Dick, just by his first name, Dick Tackerberry. And so we weren't ever calling him Grandpa or anything like that. It was just Dick and Grandmother. So we loved going up to their house because they had a really cool house and they lived in a forest. So we loved to play in the woods and just kind of, be turned loose into just acres and acres of forest to play in. And he had actually designed and built the house himself. He was a retired police lieutenant, but later in life, he built this house from scratch. He did like the lion's share of the work himself. He just learned how to do things from books and just from, experiences that he'd had building things. And I know that some of his sons helped him and everything, but he ended up building himself a house and then 2 other houses for a couple of his other kids. And so it was kind of a quirky house. It was custom, because he had designed it. And, the really cool thing about this for us as kids was playing in the woods. And then he also had a fridge in the garage that he would stock with those little Martinelli's apple juices and sodas. And we were allowed to drink as many of these fun drinks as we wanted, but there was a very strict rule that you had to finish the entire thing. So you could drink it, but if you left it half full, that was like a big no-no. Another thing that was cool is that when we would go up there, we all had a cup with our name on it. So they would just have like Tupperware cups with our name Sharpied on the bottom. So it kind of made you feel welcome as a kid. You show up, your name's already on the cup. When I think about walking into Grandmother and Dick's house, the smell that would hit you was a garlic smell. Okay, they were just always cooking with a lot of garlic. And they had 2 microwaves. Okay. And, which is kind of strange that anybody would use the microwave that much, but especially older people like this, to be that into the microwave. But Dick was always kind of an early adopter of technology. And so, he cooked everything in the microwave, like things that no one else would cook in the microwave. He would cook these little Cornish game hens, which is like a little chicken dinner, like a full little chicken. He'd cook that in the microwave. He would make hot dogs in the microwave. And the funny thing about this is that, anytime Dick would serve you any food at his house, he would ask you, like, is this the best thing you've ever had? And he wanted you to say that it was the absolute best thing you'd ever had. So, for example, he'd microwave you a hot dog, which, hot dogs, the microwave isn't really the best way to make a hot dog, but he would make you a hot dog in the microwave and then ask you, like, is this the best hot dog you've ever had in your life? And you're like, well, no, not really. And then he'd say, like, well, what's wrong with it? And you're like, oh, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. It's just not my favorite hot dog ever. And it's funny, whenever he was offered any kind of like candy or sweets or desserts or anything, he would always say, oh, I can't eat that stuff. I'm an athlete. And so I say that to this day as a joke because he would always say that. But, speaking of him and technology, he was one of the very few people at this time who knew how to program his VCR. Okay, because programming a VCR was notoriously complicated in those days, and very few people could do it. He would always program his VCR. He also had 2 VCRs, of course. And the reason that he would do this is because he refused to ever watch commercials for any reason. So he would never watch TV live, but he would always tape everything, right? This is before the internet. He would tape everything, and then he'd watch it later, and then he would fast forward the commercials. So the man would just never watch a commercial. And so this is what we would watch on TV at Grandmother's and Dick's house. We would watch Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy. We would watch a lot of murder mystery shows. Like, for example, there was a show called Murder, She Wrote. But the lady in the show, she's like an elderly woman. And he felt that she kind of looked similar to his dog, Popo. So he would just call the show Popo and say, hey, Popo's on. Or, hey, we're going to watch Popo. But we're actually watching Murder, She Wrote. We watched like Matlock. And then there was this other one called Father Dowling Mysteries. It was like a Catholic priest who solved murders or something. I don't know, but that was another one that we would watch over there. But, you know, he'd always have the TV guide, and he'd be looking at the TV guide, like a physical book of the TV guide, and then he'd program the VCR to tape all his shows and then watch them all the next day, fast forward the commercials. And here's a funny story. One time when he was at the grocery store buying the TV guide, for some reason, he commented to the lady behind the counter. It had Oprah Winfrey on the front. And he's just like, I'm so sick of seeing her face everywhere. So, you know, he made some negative comment about Oprah Winfrey. And the clerk said, well, I like her. He just right there in the store just ripped the cover off the TV guide, handed it to her, and said, here, you can have her picture then. And just issued her the picture. And she was just kind of like, what the heck? Like, she was just kind of shocked and didn't know what to do. So anyway, Dick Tackaberry in general was just kind of this larger than life character. So, you know, there are just so many stories that I could tell about Dick Tackaberry. Back when he was a police lieutenant, he was kind of a legend. And there's a movie that I don't recommend, stupid, you know, inappropriate comedy from the 80s called Police Academy. But there's a character in that film called Tackleberry that is actually based on my grandfather. Obviously, it's not accurate or anything, but just because he was known as being kind of this really bad dude of a policeman. And obviously movies are made in Hollywood. He was, you know, very well known in the LAPD as a police lieutenant. So they took the name for this movie character. His name is actually Tackleberry, but they Tackleberry is how people would often get it wrong. But anyway, there was a newspaper article that was actually clipped and framed in Grandmother and Dick's living room that said, like, Field Marshal Herr Lieutenant Tackaberry starts a riot just because he doesn't like young people. And it had like a photo of him like swinging a police baton. So that was kind of funny. He just kind of owned that diss that they were trying to give him in that. So, you know, other things that he did, like, again, there's so many stories about him. He's just kind of a larger than life character. One time, you know, as a retired old man, and in the time when we were going up there, he saw a guy drunk driving in his town. He pulls up next to the guy at a red light on his motorcycle. This is when he's totally retired. He just reaches through the guy's window, takes the guy's key, turns off the guy's car, takes the keys out of the ignition, and just says, you can pick these up at the police station. Just leaves the guy sitting at the intersection and just goes and just turns in the guy's keys at the police station. Oh, this guy's driving drunk or whatever. Another time he was at the fair with some of my family, and there was a guy walking around with an obscene t-shirt or something, or maybe it might have just had a cuss word on it or something. And he went and cussed the guy out. And it was kind of like ironic that he was like cussing the guy out for having a cuss word on his t-shirt. Like, you know, my family's here. I don't want them seeing this or whatever. And he literally made the guy take the shirt off and put it on inside out. And the guy actually did it because my grandfather was kind of an intimidating guy. He was kind of a scary guy. He's kind of a tough guy. We loved him. We loved spending time with him, hanging out with him. But you knew he was a formidable guy. When he was 17, he lied about his age, went to World War II, fought the Japanese, came back and was a police lieutenant. While he was a police lieutenant, he was really big on boxing. And so he would always teach us boxing. And the thing that he would always tell us was about the left jab. Everything works off the left jab. And he was always like explaining the virtues of the left jab and how you needed to practice the left jab. And this is what you do with the left jab. And on and on. It was a huge thing for him. He absolutely hated hippies and liberalism and stuff like that. But then it was funny, even though he hated hippies, he loved Bob Ross, the guy who painted with the big afro. So we would also watch a lot of Bob Ross when we were at his house. And he would also make hippie tea. It was like sun tea, where he would steep tea out in the sun and brew it in the sun, and he would call it hippie tea. So he was in some ways a man of contradictions. But he drove a Subaru. I remember he was the only person I ever knew that drove a Subaru. And whenever he was driving, he would always point the rear view mirror so that when you were in the back seat, he would point the rear view mirror at you so that you'd see his face and he'd see you, and he'd be always talking to you in that rear view mirror. And I remember he'd ask you something, and if you ever gave him the right answer or you gave him an answer he liked, he would just yell out, "You're right!" So he was just very animated, colorful character. So what else about Dick Tackerberry? He and grandmother would do a lot of crossword puzzles. Like I said, they love watching like Jeopardy, Wheel of Fortune, stuff like that. When we'd go up there, he had a speed bag in his garage that we'd love to play on. That was the first time I ever got to hit a speed bag. He was always, getting us excited about boxing and stuff like that. Also, my first guitar ever came from Dick Tackerberry. He pulled it up out of the rafters, and it had a giant wasp's nest built in it. So he gave me my first guitar. It was like a classical Spanish guitar with the nylon strings. And so I remember just like taking a screwdriver and trying to get all that wasp nest out of the inside. But I never did quite get it all out. So my guitar had a unique sound because it had a little bit of a wasp nest left in it. He was very negative toward Jews. And what's funny is because this is before we had learned the truth about like what the Bible says about the Jews. So we'd always been taught to be pro-Israel and pro-Jew and everything like that. And my grandfather, Dick Tackerberry, was not saved for most of my life. He got saved at the very end of his life. But at this time, he was not saved. And so, I asked my dad, I'm like, "Dad, why doesn't Dick like Jews?" And he said, "Well, it's just because he's not saved, just because he's not a Christian. That's why he's so down on Jews." But because we didn't understand the doctrine back then. Now we do. But turns out Dick was right about some stuff because, Dick was a police lieutenant. And the reason that he disliked Jews is because of the fact that he would tell us how they ran all the pornography and the human trafficking and prostitution and just all this filth. And Dick was on the Vice Squad for many years. And so he saw just all of their evil on full display. So that's what made him so negative about them. Dick also had a nickname for everybody. So he was always giving people nicknames. So different of my cousins had different names. One of them was called Buzz. One of them was called Tondalejo. I had a friend named Ashley, and he called her Gone with the Wind. I guess because there's a dude in Gone with the Wind named Ashley. Still never seen the movie. But his pastor, he called his pastor Dramamine. And it was like, what in the world? Why are you calling the pastor Dramamine? Because even though he wasn't saved, he would occasionally go to church just to make my grandmother happy. And grandmother, was a devout Christian, and she would read her Bible every single morning. And I remember when I'd be over at her house, and I'd always want to try to get up early so I could read the Bible with grandmother, like get out my Bible. She'd have her Bible, and we'd read together. And then I remember one time she saw that in the back of my Bible I had a list of stuff. And she's like, "Oh, are these verses that you like?" I'm like, "Yeah, here's these verses." And it was all like very negative stuff. It was all these like proof texts for like, if I needed to win an argument about something in the Bible. So it was like the first one was about hell being eternal. It was like verses against drinking alcohol. It was like a lot of like hard preaching stuff against sin and everything. And I remember her kind of thinking that my list was a little too negative. Like, "Oh, you seem a little focused on some of these negative things." She was trying to, make me go soft even back then. So, but she would read the Bible every morning, and she was really serious about being a Christian and stuff like that. Dick did not get saved until later after she died. He did get saved and baptized, and he expressed how he regretted not having gone to church with her more. So he said it was his biggest regret. But he called the pastor Dramamine, which is like a medicine that you take not to throw up. But this was his rationale. The pastor's name was Steve Hopper. And so in his mind, he reversed that to heave stopper, Dramamine. So, that was, I guess, the way his mind worked. But he gave out a lot of wild nicknames. So one time I was like, I want to have a nickname because everybody else has these nicknames from Dick. I want to have a nickname. So Dick said, well, come up with a nickname and tell me what you want me to call you. So I went and just got a dictionary, and I started just reading the dictionary at the letter A, and I got to the word auk, which was like a kind of bird. And so this is when I was a very little kid. I told Dick, I want to be called auk. So, it never really caught on. But anyway, so he had a lot of nicknames for people that he would give out. But I'm going to tell you now the very best Dick Tackerberry story. Because like I said, there are a lot of stories. But the very best story is the Taco Bell story. So if you've already heard the Taco Bell story, you can shut off the video now. I don't think I've told it from the pulpit or anything. So hopefully this is new to most people. But there was this time when Dick Tackerberry picked us up in Sacramento, and us and a whole bunch of our cousins, we were all going to go up to Dick and Grandmother's because they lived about, I don't know, maybe like 45 minutes or an hour from us, because they lived up in Grass Valley, California, which is up by like Auburn and stuff. So, they were taking us up there, but we made a stop at Taco Bell. And when we were kids, like we rarely got to do like an all you can eat. Usually, you ate your meal and you were always kind of left feeling a little bit still hungry. And so you didn't get to just totally gorge or pig out necessarily when you went out to fast food. So Dick Tackerberry, he told us, he said, look, you can order whatever you want. He said, I want you to go crazy. I mean, just you guys, and this is like me, my siblings, my cousins, like you can have whatever food you want. All those like expensive items on the menu that your parents wouldn't necessarily order for you, because it's just like a ripoff, like the Mexican pizza, the enchilada, the taco supreme. I don't know. It was just like you could eat whatever you want. As many tacos, burritos, just you could have all the food you want. But he said, but there's one catch. And the one catch is you can't have anything to drink. So I was like, what? Okay. So we all go to Taco Bell. And I mean, we're just chowing down, just nachos, Bel Grande, and just tacos and burritos and cinnamon crispas and and we're just eating so much. And we said, well, can we just get water? Because water's free, because if it's a money thing. And he's like, no. He's like, no, nothing to drink. You can eat as much as you want. You just can't get a drink. So we're like, okay, whatever. So we chow down on all this fast food with all the sodium that goes along with it. And then we get in the car and we're heading up to his house. And, then we have like almost an hour drive. And so we are just absolutely dying of thirst because we've eaten all that salty Mexican food and we're just so thirsty. We get to Grandmother and Dick's house and, we burst through the door and his wife had made this big bowl of punch, okay? And so we all just run in and we're just, oh man, this is so good. Oh, this is the best punch I've ever had in my life. Oh, it tastes so good. And Grandmother's is like, oh, I'm glad you guys like it or whatever. And because she didn't realize what had happened. And it turned out that the whole point of this ruse was that Grandmother had made this punch. And she was kind of like, oh, I hope they like the punch. I'm not sure if the kids are really going to like it. So she was like a little self-conscious about making this punch. And he just really wanted to make sure that we really appreciated the punch and that she felt appreciated. So, he did this whole plan so that we would all come in and just rave about how the punch was the greatest thing and just absolutely drain the punch bowl. Oh, which brings me to, of course, Grandmother had a nickname too. He would call his wife the Bod, which is kind of a funny nickname for, your grandma to be called the Bod. But that's what she was called. And another funny thing was when you'd go into their bathroom, everything was really custom in this house. Because like I said, he designed it and built it himself. So it had like really fancy, in their room, they had like a really fancy like bathtub with jets. And then in the guest bathroom, they had this fancy shower. But the funny thing was it had like a heat lamp as well. So you could turn on the normal light, but then you could flip another switch and it would turn on this red hot heat lamp So it's just kind of weird because the whole room would just glow red and you'd feel like the warmth of it as well. So, and then when you'd go to use the bathroom, there was this little stuffed frog that was like perched, like looking down on you while you used the bathroom. And then on the back of the toilet was the reading material, was a book about Einstein's theory of relativity on the back of the toilet. So it was kind of a funny thing growing up. Anyway, that's about it for Dick Tackerberry. I hope you enjoyed the story. God bless you and have a great day.